There's much evidence that, especially in Florida, that election was stolen. I don't know that anybody who's investigated this matter would say otherwise. This was a stolen election.
I am proud to have Dick Cheney by my side.
The response of people to the stolen election was that Bush was, in fact, he seemed a bit of a fool to begin with. Plus, he was a criminal in the stealing of the election. Plus, the Supreme Court had overridden laws to steal the election, that is, state laws that required recounts. And so he was an object of contempt, ridicule, mockery, and hatred as he entered the White House. And I wondered how he was going to successfully govern. Well, not only did he have this, they were throwing eggs at him in his victory, you know, as he was inaugurated. Not only did he have this on the plate to deal with, but he also had his best friend and primary financer, the man who ran his transportation with a private plane and so forth, Ken Lay, who was the head of Enron, Enron was now in a period of collapse, where millions of stockholders had been built out of their savings and their pensions, and it was the biggest corporate fraud in American history, and he was the single biggest backer of Bush. The economy was in a downslide. In August, just a few weeks before 9/11, there was the biggest demonstration in history against the whole corporate trade regime that was occurring with the meeting of the G7 and so forth. There were over 500,000 people present at that meeting, demonstrating against it, and they had warplanes flying overhead. It was like a rehearsal for the 9/11 regime that was going to, post 9/11 regime that was going to come, and that was to simply terrorize all opponents to the New World Trade and Investment regime, which just overrides all borders and legislations and constitutions. That was very huge, 500,000 people in Italy. Just a few weeks later occurs 9/11. So if anybody had interest in 9/11 happening, the question of an answer to cui bono, the Bush administration did. Well, we don't just end there, and that question has been silenced. We ask about the explanation of the damages. What were the damages that occurred here? And now there's been much written on this, and I'm not going to repeat it here. But if we do look at the damages, we see that the fall of the buildings isn't plausible by the airplanes knocking into them. 240 external columns, 45 core columns of heavy metal that can't be burnt by kerosene fuel any more than your camping stove can be burned by kerosene fuel, which is equivalent to the type of fuel in airplanes. The fall of those buildings could not be explained by airplanes knocking into them. Their airplanes had knocked into such buildings before. They hadn't fallen. There had been local hits and local fires, and that was it. The subsequent evidence of the damage to the buildings and how the damage occurred indicated pulverizing of the cement. People are saying now that there are many reports coming forth of people hearing explosions inside the building. 40 of the fire people who were involved in fighting the fire heard explosions, had reported hearing explosions. There's much documentation of the hearing of the explosions. But how do we know whether it was pulverized, which would happen within a controlled demolition? We don't know whether that was the case or not, because the evidence for it, all that cement and so forth and metal, which we could have examined in a post-murder and atrocity examination, was very quickly removed, and that was on the hard orders of Rudy Giuliani, who threatened anybody with their job if they didn't move to a very fast removal of all the remaining evidence of what happened to those buildings. And then we have, moving on to the post-event evidence of guilt and what people do when they're guilty. They cover it up, and the continuance of the crime that they had planned beforehand. And we again have evidence that the official conspiracy theory, of course, just rules out altogether the removal of the evidence itself, the stacking of the investigation with Bush, people who are known Bush supporters, the crushing of all questions of what went on, and the accusation accusing of people as being unpatriotic, and the non-stop sequence of planned revolutionary transition which was what the Project for a New American Century had foretold was going to happen. We were going to have a revolutionary transition, but it would be a long transition absent some catastrophic and cataclysmic event, like Pearl Harbor. That was before 9/11. Well, indeed, all of that happened in accordance with plan, the Project of the New American Century. And it went on to the supreme crime that we now have before us of the Iraq War, which under international law is the supreme crime. Just to give you a sense of how Canadians themselves have been involved in this whole terrible atrocity, that 2 days before the criminal invasion of Iraq by the United States and its allies, I was on CBC television debating Thomas Donnelly, who was one of the founders of the Project for a New American Century. The concern I have is not to wind it back to who's responsible for Saddam Hussein, but rather what is happening to the Iraqi people. And we have, with the U.S. proceeding to go unilaterally in announcing its intention to wage war, it is already in violation of the Nuremberg Charter. A war crime begins with the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war in violation of international treaties, agreements, or insurance. In fact, there's impeachment proceedings, articles being drawn up in the United States for also violating the U.S. War Crimes Act, and we also have such a War Crimes Act here. Thomas is advocating war crime here. I suppose he would be, in this sense, subject to the application of the law there as well.
War crimes because they're invading another country?
Yes, without validation by the Security Council of the United Nations and in violation of international law. And then the war crime is already in place when you start to move outside. And they have announced very clearly their intention to move with or without the UN. And that is a war crime to proceed to do, to wage, to prepare and plan for war. In Mr. Donnelly's recent article, he said planning for war. He himself is advocating a war crime.
Look, that past statement was so morally, politically, legally perverse that I have to raise objection to it. Look, let's begin with the legal argument. Surely UN Resolution 1441 already provides the basis for taking military action against Iraq.
You are advocating the planning and preparation for war against Iraq without any international legitimation by the Security Council. So you are now advocating a war crime.
Well, obviously we're not having much of a dialogue here. Well, I don't know what serious consequences was understood by the diplomatic community to mean other than that there would be military action taken to enforce Resolution 1441 and also to enforce the previous 16 resolutions.
This is a complete non sequitur. It does not follow from 1441. This has been declared by including the Secretary General. It is, you see, there's a presupposition here that God is America, and America makes these judgments, or its president makes these judgments, independent of international law. And that you have, it's not just international law, the war crimes, but the International Criminal Court. You refuse to sign on for it. You refuse to sign on for the legislation against crimes against humanity and war crimes. You refuse to sign on and indeed have sabotage conventions on chemical and biological weapons, on the ABM Treaty, on Kyoto Protocol, and on you go. You are a rogue administration. Okay, you are the biggest danger.
Look, I would like to conclude by saying that the use of American power in the world has been, as a matter of practical and historical fact, the sole reliable instruments, first of all, for bringing peace and stability and freedom to the European continent. Secondly, we hope now to do the same sort of thing in Iraq.
Back to the CBC story, that after I said this about he was counseling a war crime and so forth, the CBC fired the person, or he was removed from his job, the person who had originally invited me to debate this person, Thomas Donnelly from the U.S. Project for the American Century. Now that was, although I was just giving the truth of the matter, it was something that was just repressed and unspeakable, and that's the kind of condition we've lived in throughout and continue to live in with today.